The morning I realized my mother-in-law had never once asked me a single question about my work, I was sitting across from her at a mahogany dining table that probably cost more than my first car, watching her cut her filet mignon into perfect little squares, like a woman who had never once questioned her own authority over a room. She was talking about her husband's company the way some people talk about cathedrals, with reverence, with ownership, with the particular pride of someone who believes proximity to greatness is the same thing as being great. I smiled. I sipped my water. I said nothing. I had been saying nothing for a very long time, and I was extraordinarily good at it by then. But I should start at the beginning, because the beginning is where the whole shape of the thing becomes clear. My name is Caroline Marsh, Caroline Whitfield before I married Daniel, and some days I wish I had kept that name, not out of nostalgia, but out of accuracy. Whitfield was the name I built things under. Marsh was the name I spent 3 years trying to fit inside. I was 27 when I married Daniel Marsh at a vineyard in Sonoma County on an October Saturday when the sky was the exact color of old honey. I was 30 years old when I sat in that attorney's office in downtown San Francisco with my hands folded on the table and watched every assumption my mother-in-law had ever made about me get systematically and permanently corrected. In between those two dates, a lot happened. Daniel Marsh was 31 when we got married. Handsome in the way that gets noticed in a room before it gets examined. Strong jaw, easy smile, the particular confidence of a man who had grown up being told he was going somewhere. He worked in business development for a mid-sized tech consulting firm in the Bay Area, and he was good at it, genuinely good. The kind of person who could walk into a meeting and make everyone feel like the room had been waiting for him. I fell for all of it. I fell for the charm and the warmth and the way he looked at me across a crowded fundraiser when we first met, like I was the only fixed point in a spinning room. I fell for the version of him that existed in those early months before I understood that the version I was seeing was the curated one, the one he put on for people whose opinion he wanted. I was, at the time we married, the managing director of Whitfield Capital, the independent investment firm I had founded at 24 with $200,000 of my own savings and 2 years of painstaking relationship building in the financial technology sector. I don't say that to perform modesty or false confidence. I say it because it matters to everything that came after. By the time Daniel and I got engaged, Whitfield Capital had made and exited several significant early-stage investments and managed a portfolio worth a little over $47 million. I had 7 full-time employees, a small office in the Soma neighborhood in San Francisco, and a reputation in a particular corner of the investment world that I had built so carefully and so specifically that very few people outside that world knew my name. That was by design. In the kind of work I did, being known in the right rooms was everything. Being known in the wrong ones could cost you deals before you even had a chance to make them. So I was selective. I was private. I let my track record speak, and I spoke very little outside the context that required it. Daniel knew what I did. In the early months of our relationship, we talked about it openly. He asked good questions, seemed genuinely curious, and I appreciated that he didn't seem threatened or diminished by the fact that I had built something substantial before we ever met. Or at least, I believed he wasn't threatened. I believed a lot of things then that later unraveled so cleanly it was almost architectural, the way a building comes apart when you remove the right beam. What Daniel never did, not once in the 3 years we were together before the marriage, not once in the 3 years we were married, was tell his family what I actually did, or what I had actually built. His parents knew I worked in finance. His mother, Vivian Marsh, had decided very early that this meant I worked for someone in some capacity that was adjacent to real work, but not quite the same as the kind of real work her husband had done. Vivian's husband, Robert Marsh, had founded a logistics and supply chain management company called Marsh Logistics Solutions in the late 90s, built it through the early 2000s with real tenacity and intelligence, and grown it into a regional firm with contracts across the western United States. Robert Marsh was a self-made man in the truest sense of the phrase, and Vivian had spent 40 years making sure that everyone in their orbit understood this about him, and by extension, about herself. I respected what Robert had built. I genuinely did. He was sharp, direct, unimpressed by theater, and he had the particular dignity of someone who had solved real problems with limited resources and understood what that actually required. Vivienne was a different matter. Vivienne Marsh was 63 years old when I married her son, and she had the bearing of a woman who had never once doubted her own assessment of a situation. She was tall, elegantly dressed in the way that requires significant ongoing effort and resources, and she had perfected the specific social maneuver of delivering a dismissal so smoothly that it landed before you understood what had happened. She didn't dislike me exactly. It was more precise than that. She had categorized me before she'd finished shaking my hand at the first dinner Daniel brought me to. Young woman, finance-adjacent work, no family connections in the Bay Area, no history she could place. She was polite to me the way you're polite to a temp employee, cordial, not unkind, but with a foundational assumption that I was not a permanent part of the landscape she was managing. And Daniel, for reasons I spent a long time trying to understand and eventually accepted without fully excusing, let her. He let her assume. He corrected nothing. He offered no clarification when she made comments that placed me clearly in a supporting role in the architecture of our life together. Maybe he was protecting something. His mother's comfort, his own position in her hierarchy, some version of himself that existed in her eyes and required a wife who was not visibly more capable than he was. I don't know for certain. What I know is that he chose not to tell her the truth. And that choice had consequences for all of us. The first time Vivienne's assumptions became fully visible to me, we had been married about 4 months. We were at Sunday dinner at the Marsh family home in Hillsborough, a beautiful, enormous house on a quiet street lined with oak trees, the kind of house that communicates arrival so fluently you barely have to say a word. Robert was at the head of the table, talking about a contract renewal he was working through, some complexity with a new carrier partner in the Pacific Northwest. I listened carefully because the logistics sector was something I understood reasonably well, and I asked a question about their current fulfillment model. Robert looked up with what I recognized as genuine interest and started to answer. And Vivienne, setting down her wine glass with the soft certainty of a judge's gavel, said, "Oh, Robert, she's just being polite. I'm sure she doesn't actually need to understand all that." I looked at Daniel. Daniel looked at his plate. I said nothing. That was the moment I understood the dynamic I was operating in. And that was the moment I decided how I was going to navigate it, which was with complete, deliberate patience, because here is what neither Vivienne nor Daniel knew, and what I had known for approximately 14 months by that point. Whitfield Capital was the primary outside investor in Marsh Logistics Solutions. My firm had led a growth capital round for the company 18 months before Daniel and I got married, at a point when Robert Marsh was looking to expand his operational footprint into the southwestern corridor and needed capital he couldn't source through his existing banking relationships on the terms that made the expansion viable. My introduction to Robert had come through a mutual connection in the supply chain finance space, and after 6 weeks of due diligence and several very long conversations about the company's fundamentals, I had structured a deal that brought $12 million into Marsh Logistics in exchange for a meaningful equity stake and a seat on the advisory board that I had quietly delegated to one of my senior associates. The investment was performing well. The company had grown its contract volume by 31% in the first year post-investment. Robert Marsh was, by any measure, a good operator. I had made a good bet. And then, 4 months after that investment closed, I met his son at a fundraiser for a pediatric hospital in Pacific Heights. And Daniel Marsh walked across the room toward me with that easy smile, and I made a different kind of bet. I did not tell Daniel who I was in relation to his father's company. Not on the first date, not on the 5th, not at the point where I knew we were becoming something serious. This was not deception. It was discretion. The same discretion I applied to every professional relationship that touched my personal life. I had signed confidentiality agreements in connection with the investment, and I took those seriously. More than that, I didn't want the information to be the thing that defined how he saw me in either direction. I wanted to understand who Daniel Marsh was independent of what I had or hadn't done that was adjacent to his family. By the time I was certain I was in love with him, I had decided I would tell him before we got engaged. There was a conversation I planned, a dinner I chose, a Sunday afternoon I set aside. He proposed on a Saturday in March overlooking the bay, and I was so caught in the feeling of that moment that the planned conversation dissolved And I said yes, and we moved forward into engagement without me ever having it. Not because I was hiding something, because I was happy. And happy people sometimes make the mistake of believing the happiness is stable, that the thing you've been meaning to address will wait a little longer, that you'll find the right moment soon. I never found the right moment. And then we were married. And then the window when it would have been simple had passed, and the conversation became more complicated. And the longer I waited, the more complicated it grew, until it had become the kind of silence that takes on its own weight and requires specific conditions to break. I want to be clear about something. Robert Marsh, as a member of his own company's advisory board structure, understood that Whitfield Capital held a significant stake in his business. He had interacted with my firm throughout the investment relationship. He had met me twice in professional settings before I ever met his son. Whether he connected those dots after I became Daniel's girlfriend, I genuinely do not know. Robert was a careful man who kept his professional and personal business in distinct compartments. If he recognized my name when Daniel introduced us, he gave no sign of it. If he had questions about the overlap between his investor and his future daughter-in-law, he did not ask them at Sunday dinners. This was, in a way, the most sophisticated response possible, and I had a kind of quiet respect for it. Vivian, for her part, didn't know. She had never been involved in the financial operations of Robert's company. That was his domain entirely, and she had always seemed proud of the clarity of that boundary. She knew he had investors, the way you know a fact without it having texture or meaning. She did not know their names, their backgrounds, their stakes, or their identities. And so she sat across from her daughter-in-law at countless dinners over 3 years and delivered her gentle, consistent, perfectly calibrated underestimations with the confidence of someone who had all the information she needed. She didn't. She had almost none of it. The marriage deteriorated slowly, then all at once, which is how most things deteriorate, if you're paying attention. The first year was good, genuinely. We were building something, both of us adjusting to cohabitation and shared calendars and the small negotiations of two people who had lived alone for a long time. We bought a house in Palo Alto, a beautiful craftsman on a wide tree-lined street, 1,200 square feet of original hardwood floors and morning light that came through the east-facing kitchen windows in long, warm rectangles. I put in the larger portion of the down payment, a fact that was recorded in our purchase agreement and in my own financial records, and in exactly no conversations with Vivian Marsh, who, when she visited, remarked on what a lovely home Daniel had chosen. I smiled. I offered her coffee. I said nothing about the down payment. The second year, things began to shift in ways I cataloged but did not yet act on. Daniel's interest in my work, which had always been slightly performative, engaged enough to pass as genuine, but never quite deep enough to require him to actually understand what I did, began to carry a different quality. There was a wariness in it, an occasional edge, a reaction when I mentioned a deal, or a meeting, or a decision that I had made that landed just slightly wrong, like a note played a half-step flat. Nothing I could point to directly, nothing that would survive being spoken aloud, just a pattern I registered and filed. He started saying things like, not everyone needs to know every detail about what you do, in context where it seemed to be specifically about his family. He said, sometimes I just don't want to make it a whole thing, which I understood to mean that the truth about what I did and what I had built was, in his social environment, a complication he preferred not to manage. I let this pass longer than I should have. I told myself it was social anxiety. His particular relationship with his mother's approval, something that would resolve itself when we were more settled. I was wrong about the resolve. By the end of the second year, I'd begun keeping a separate personal ledger. Not because I suspected specific financial misconduct. I didn't, not then. But because I am, at my core, someone who documents things. It's how I think, how I assess risk, how I protect myself from my own optimism. I wrote down amounts, dates, the precise texture of conversations. I noted when things didn't add up, not in any dramatic way, just in the small, particular way of a person trained to read financial patterns, noticing that the numbers didn't quite say what the words claimed. 3 months before the dinner that changed everything, I found the messages. This is the part I can say plainly without performing drama about it, because by that point I had been paying attention for long enough that the discovery was less like a lightning strike and more like reaching the last page of a chapter you'd been reading for months. Daniel had been having an ongoing emotional and physical affair with a woman named Brianna Cole, who worked in business strategy at a firm in Mountain View and who had apparently been a presence in his life since approximately 8 months into our marriage. The messages were extensive, affectionate, and occasionally financial. He had paid for 3 trips, a weekend in Carmel that he told me was a work retreat, a 4-day stay in Seattle that he accounted for with an industry conference I could not find any record of when I looked. The amounts were not enormous individually. They totaled, across the period I could trace, approximately $22,000 that had moved through an account I was technically aware of, but hadn't been monitoring closely. I sat in the kitchen of our Craftsman house on a Wednesday evening at 9:15, my phone in my hand and a cup of tea gone cold beside me. And I thought, how long? Then I thought, how much? Then I thought about everything else that was true at that particular moment. The house, the joint accounts, the investment stake, the dinner table in Hillsborough, Vivian cutting her filet into perfect squares and pronouncing on the company her husband had built. And I felt something settle in my chest that was not grief. It was closer to clarity, the kind that comes when you stop hoping a thing will resolve itself and accept that it won't, and that you will have to resolve it yourself. I did not confront Daniel that night. I did not confront him that week. I called an attorney named Margaret Okonkwo, who was referred to me by a woman in my professional network, who described her as absolutely without sentiment and exactly what you want, and I made an appointment for the following Thursday. I also called my senior associate at Whitfield Capital, a man named David Chen, who had been with me for 4 years and who had been managing our relationship with the Marsh Logistics Advisory Board on my behalf. I told David I needed a comprehensive current summary of our investment position, our equity percentage, and any outstanding authorizations pending. He had it to me by end of business the next day. I also began moving my personal assets, the ones I was legally entitled to move independently, into accounts that were mine alone. This took 3 weeks and was executed without drama or announcement. I consulted with Margaret about what I could and could not do within the bounds of California marital property law, and I stayed carefully within those bounds. I was not trying to take anything that wasn't mine. I was trying to make sure that what was mine remained accessible to me during what was about to become a complicated period. And then I waited for the right moment, because in my experience, the right moment presents itself if you're patient enough to recognize it when it does. The dinner in Hillsborough, the one I started with, the mahogany table, the filet mignon, the honey-colored Sunday light, happened 3 weeks after I met with Margaret. I had not yet served Daniel with anything. I had not yet had a direct conversation with him about what I knew. I was attending Sunday dinner because I had calculated that appearing to attend Sunday dinner was the correct strategic move for that particular point in the timeline, and because something in me, the part that had watched Vivian operate for 3 years, wanted to be present for what was coming. I had made a phone call the previous week. I had set something in motion. And I sat at that table with my water glass and my careful smile, and I waited. The dinner was, for most of its length, ordinary. Robert talked about the expansion into Arizona that the company had been planning, a new distribution hub outside Phoenix that would add significant capacity and require a fresh capital authorization from the investment partnership. Vivian talked about their upcoming trip to Portugal, which she had planned with significant attention to detail. Daniel talked about a new client prospect he was pursuing. I listened. I asked appropriate questions. I ate. And then Vivian said something. She said it in the particular tone she reserved for statements she considered self-evident, a tone I had catalogued across 3 years, a tone that carried the warmth of a wall. She was speaking to Robert about the Portugal trip, something about the expense of it, and she laughed and said, "Well, you've earned it. You built this thing from nothing." And then she looked at me with that smile and said, "I always tell people, there are men who build things, and then there are the people who come along for the ride. And women like you," she said, gesturing at me with just the slightest movement of her fork. Not unkind, just certain. Women in finance, they always know how to be around successful men. It's a skill, really. The table was very quiet for a moment. Daniel looked at his plate. Robert looked at Vivian with an expression that was difficult to fully read. Not quite discomfort, not quite warning, something more complicated than either. I set down my water glass. I looked at Vivian, and I said with complete serenity, You might be right about that. Because I was not going to answer her then. I was going to let the man who was walking through the front door 2 minutes later answer her for me. I had called James Whitmore the previous Tuesday. James was the president of Marsh Logistics Solutions, Robert's second in command, the person who managed day-to-day operational decisions, and served as the primary liaison to the investment partnership when board-level matters required attention. I had worked with James throughout our investment relationship, and he knew exactly who I was and what my firm's position in the company represented. I had told him that I would be attending Sunday dinner at the Marsh family home this weekend and that I needed him to stop by at approximately 7:30 with the authorization paperwork for the Phoenix expansion that required my signature before the capital deployment could proceed. I explained that I had some reasons for this timing that I would share with him later, and that I would appreciate his professionalism in handling the interaction as he would any standard business call. James, who was himself a precise and unflappable person, said, "Of course, Caroline, I'll be there at 7:30. The doorbell rang at 7:28. Robert looked mildly surprised. Vivian looked faintly annoyed. Daniel looked at the door with the slightly unfocused expression of someone who doesn't yet understand what is happening. I looked at my hands. The housekeeper showed James into the dining room. Robert's houses had that particular quality of preparedness, someone always available to open a door. And James came in with his briefcase and his entirely ordinary professional bearing, and he said, "I'm sorry to interrupt a family dinner, Robert." And then his eyes moved to me, and he said, "Caroline, I'm glad you're here. We need your authorization on the Phoenix expansion before we can move the capital deployment forward. The board packet requires your signature as lead investor. We can't approve anything without her authorization." He said it exactly the way you say a fact. Not for drama, not for theater, just the way you state the true thing when the true thing is the relevant thing. The table was very still. Vivian looked at James. Then she looked at me. Then she looked at her husband. "Her authorization," she said. The words came out slowly, like she was feeling the shape of them. For what? Robert Marsh set down his fork. He looked at his wife with the expression of a man who had known a moment was coming for some time and had simply been waiting to see what shape it would take. He said, "Vivienne, Caroline is the managing director of the firm that led our growth capital round 3 years ago. Whitfield Capital holds a significant equity stake in the company. Caroline is the lead investor. She has been this whole time." The room was so quiet, I could hear the oak trees outside settling in the evening wind. Vivian looked at me. She was searching my face for something. Confusion, apology, some indication that there had been a miscommunication. She found none of those things. She found the same expression I had been wearing all evening, which was the expression of someone who has known the whole truth for long enough that there is no urgency in the revealing of it. James completed his business with me professionally and efficiently. I signed the authorization documents with the pen he provided, handed them back to him, and thanked him for coming by. He said good evening to the table, nodded to Robert, and left. The whole interaction took perhaps 4 minutes. I looked at Vivienne. She had the particular stillness of someone who has been handed a map of territory they thought they knew completely, and found that everything has different names. I said quietly, "I have a meeting with my attorney tomorrow morning. I'm going to be serving Daniel with divorce papers this week. I thought you should know before that happens, rather than after." And I looked at Daniel, who had not moved, who had not spoken, who was holding his wine glass with both hands like it was the only fixed thing in the room. And I said, "We can talk about the details through counsel. I think that's cleaner for both of us." I folded my napkin. I thanked Robert for dinner. I said goodnight to the table. I walked out of the Marsh family dining room and down the front steps and to my car, which I had parked at the bottom of the driveway, and I drove home on a highway that was nearly empty at that hour, the bay glittering to my left like scattered glass, and I felt the specific, quiet satisfaction of a long patience finally completed. I will tell you what the next 6 months looked like, because I think it matters for the full shape of this story to be visible. The divorce proceedings were managed by Margaret Okonkwo with a precision I found genuinely admirable. Daniel retained his own attorney, a man named Spencer Hale, who had a reputation for aggressive negotiation, and I suspect the early strategy was to counterfile on grounds of marital waste, my having moved personal assets during the marriage, until Spencer Hale examined the financial record that Margaret had assembled and understood that every movement I had made was properly documented, legally within bounds, and supported by a paper trail so thorough it was essentially its own argument. After that, the negotiations shifted. The house in Palo Alto was valued at $2,140,000 at the time of the proceedings. My documented contribution to the down payment, $150,000, was the larger share. The joint funds contributed to the mortgage over 3 years were divided as marital property. The remaining equity after a buyout calculation was substantial, and the settlement reflected my position accurately. Daniel kept certain personal accounts and a retirement fund he had held independently. I kept my firm, my separate accounts, and a negotiated settlement that accounted for the marital assets I was entitled to, including appropriate recognition of the $22,000 that had moved through joint funds to support his affair, which Margaret documented with the same thoroughness she applied to everything. My investment stake in Marsh Logistics Solutions was entirely mine. It had been established by my firm before the marriage and held by Whitfield Capital as a business asset. This was not subject to marital property division. I want to be clear about that because I think it matters. I did not gain anything from the Marsh family in the divorce that I had not already earned independently before Daniel and I ever met. The investment was mine because I had structured it, funded it, and managed it. The divorce did not change that. What the divorce did was give me back my name. Not legally. I kept Marsh professionally for about 6 months because of active deal relationships, and then returned to Whitfield in every context that counted. But internally, the particular name you use to think about yourself, the one that fits. Brianna Cole, the woman Daniel had been seeing, is a separate chapter in a book I don't particularly need to keep. She was not my enemy. She was a person who made choices that intersected with my life, and those choices had consequences for her as well as for him. When the divorce proceedings became known in their social circle, as these things do, the relationship between Daniel and Brianna did not survive the transition from secret to daylight. Affairs that live in concealment are often sustained by the energy of that concealment, the particular intensity of a thing that cannot be acknowledged. When it can be acknowledged, when it has to be, the intensity frequently dissipates, and what remains is just two people who had something under conditions that no longer exist. Daniel and Brianna ended, as I understood from mutual acquaintances I still had, within 4 months of the proceedings becoming known. I did not feel satisfaction about this. I did not feel anything about it in particular. It was simply a thing that happened in a story I was no longer living inside. What I felt more acutely was the aftermath with Vivian. Not because I wanted her understanding or her apology. I didn't, particularly. But because there was something I needed to think through clearly about what her behavior had actually meant and what it should cost. Vivian reached out 3 weeks after that Sunday dinner. She sent a letter. Actual paper, actual envelope, actual handwriting, which I will grant was a particular form of commitment, that arrived at the Palo Alto house addressed to me. In it, she said that she was sorry for assumptions she had made, that she had clearly not understood the full picture of who I was, and that she hoped the circumstances of the divorce could be handled with minimal difficulty for everyone involved, including Robert, whose business relationship with my firm she hoped would remain intact. That last part, the part about Robert, about the business relationship, was not a secret in the letter. It was the point of the letter, dressed in the language of apology. Vivian was writing to me as a person who had just understood for the first time that I had leverage she had been entirely unaware of, and she was writing with the specific intention of managing that leverage. The apology was real in its way. I believe she was genuinely startled, genuinely recalibrated, but the apology was also a business communication, and I read it as one. I did not write back, not because I was punishing her. I had no interest in punishment as such. It's too consuming and yields too little. But because there was nothing I needed to say that would change the facts, and the facts didn't require my response. My investment relationship with Marsh Logistics was governed by professional documents and fiduciary obligations, not by my feelings about my former mother-in-law. If the investment continued to perform well, I would continue to fulfill my obligations as a lead investor. If it didn't, I would make decisions accordingly. Vivian's letter had no bearing on either of those things, and writing back to reassure her would have been a comfort I was not obligated to provide. Robert called me directly 2 days after I received Vivian's letter. This was different. Robert called me on my work cell, the number that appeared in our business communications, and he spoke to me the way he always had in professional contexts, directly, without preamble, with the economy of a person who values clarity above politeness. He said, "I owe you an apology that I'm not sure I can make adequately, because I knew who you were when my son introduced you to me, and I made a decision not to say anything, and I'm not certain I made the right decision." He paused. He said, "I thought it was Daniel's place to tell his mother, and then I thought it was yours, and I kept thinking it was someone else's place, and so none of us said anything." I told him I appreciated him calling. I told him I didn't blame him for his silence. He had been in an impossible position, and I understood that. I told him the investment relationship was not in jeopardy from my end, and that I intended to continue as a professional partner to the company as long as the fundamentals warranted it. He thanked me. He said he was sorry about his son. He said it simply and without elaboration, the way you say a thing when you mean it more than the words can carry. That was a harder conversation than Vivian's letter, because Robert's regret was actual. There was no management in it, no calculation I could detect, just a man in his late 60s reckoning with a version of events that had been unfolding in his own dining room without his intervention for 3 years. I had more compassion for Robert in that moment than I had felt for most people in the preceding months. He had not been complicit in Vivian's condescension. He had been absent from it in the particular way men sometimes are absent from the things their wives do in rooms they assume don't require their attention. Vivian Marsh spent the months following the divorce in a social position that I found, when I heard about it through the acquaintances who remained connected to both our circles, somewhat altered from the position she had occupied before. Not destroyed, Vivian was not a person who could be fully dismantled by a single revelation. She had too much architecture for that. But shifted. The story had moved through the Hillsborough social network in the way stories do, with the particulars somewhat compressed and dramatized in the retelling, and what remained in general circulation was the basic fact. Vivian had spent 3 years dismissing her daughter-in-law's professional standing, while the daughter-in-law held a significant stake in Robert's company. The specifics were less important than the shape of the thing, and the shape was not flattering. I heard from mutual acquaintances that Vivian had stopped making pronouncements about the finance industry at dinner parties. I heard that she was somewhat quieter in general on the subject of who builds things and who merely benefits from being around people who do. I don't know if this constituted growth on her part or simply recalibration, the adjusting of behavior in response to social consequence rather than actual reflection. I suspect it was somewhere in between, which is probably the most honest place most people's change lives. I did not need her to have transformed. I needed her to have received accurate information about the world she was actually living in, and she had received it. That was sufficient. Daniel settled the divorce without going to trial. The final terms, signed 18 months after that Sunday dinner, awarded me the equity from the Palo Alto house. After the buyout calculation, my share came to approximately $460,000, plus a financial accounting that included the $22,000 traced to marital funds used during the affair. The accounting was not enormous in the context of what I had and what I had built, but it was precise, and precision is its own form of satisfaction. Daniel retained his retirement account, his personal vehicle, and a modest savings account. He gave up any claim to assets I held through Whitfield Capital, which was never in question legally, but which the explicit documentation have made permanently clear. He did not contest this in any meaningful way. His attorney had looked at the record. There wasn't a version of that record that helped Daniel. Brianna Cole, for her part, lost something that I think cost her more than money, which was the version of the future she had been building in her mind. She had believed, I know this because of the messages I had read, which were often extremely revealing about her expectations, that she was a person who was being chosen. She was being chosen for something significant, something that would reorganize itself around her once the complications resolved. What she actually was a person who had been convenient. When the complication became too structural to manage, Daniel's instinct was to reduce his exposure, not to commit. She had organized a significant portion of her emotional life around a premise that turned out to be false. And the revealing of that premise in the context of public divorce proceedings was not a gentle experience. She reached out to me once about 2 months after the filing. A text message to my personal number that said, "I think we should talk. I want you to understand what actually happened." I read it. I did not respond. There was nothing she could tell me about what actually happened that I did not already know. And there was nothing I owed her in the way of conversation. She was not my problem to solve, and her desire to explain herself to me was her need, not mine. I deleted the message and made coffee and went to my desk and spent the morning on a term sheet for a new investment that had nothing to do with any of this. I am 31 years old now. I am writing this, or rather telling this, from an apartment in Hayes Valley in San Francisco that is entirely mine, on the 15th floor of a building with east-facing windows that fill the main room with the same kind of morning light I used to have in the Craftsman in Palo Alto, and I have learned to simply sit in it without comparing it to anything that came before. The apartment is smaller than the house. It is also, in every way that matters, larger. There is no performance required here. There is no version of myself I need to maintain for anyone's comfort. I make coffee in the morning without calculating what the sound of the grinder communicates to someone else in the house. I eat breakfast looking at the bay. I read for as long as I want. I work at hours that make sense for the work, not hours that represent acceptable behavior in someone else's narrative about who I am. Whitfield Capital has grown since the period I've been describing. We closed on a new fund last year. $93 million, the largest we've raised. And we're deploying into early-stage enterprise infrastructure companies with the particular patience the sector requires. My team has grown to 11 people. I am proud of this in the specific, unperformative way you're proud of something you built with your own hands over time that required choices you were not always sure of, and risks that didn't always resolve cleanly, and years of a discipline that felt, occasionally, like it was costing you things it shouldn't have had to cost. My investment in Marsh Logistics continues to perform. Robert Marsh has become, in the context of that professional relationship, someone I genuinely respect and from whom I have learned things about operational management that I apply elsewhere in my portfolio. We have a clean professional relationship built on accurate information and mutual respect, and the particular clarity that comes when two people know exactly what they owe each other and nothing more. He invited me to the company's 25th anniversary event last spring, and I attended briefly and shook hands with people who knew my name for the right reasons. Vivienne was there. She looked at me from across the room with an expression I have spent some time thinking about and cannot entirely characterize. There was, I thought, something in it that might have been the beginning of understanding, or might have been the specific discomfort of a person who sees themselves accurately for the first time and finds the view unwelcome. I nodded to her. She nodded back. That was enough. I want to tell you 3 things I learned from this particular chapter of my life because I think they are useful and because I did not learn them for free. The first, the assumption that someone is small because they are quiet is one of the most expensive assumptions a person can make. Vivienne spent 3 years making it about me. I had let her make it because my silence was strategic and useful, and ultimately more powerful than any correction I could have offered in the moment. But I have also examined the ways in which I stayed quiet, not because I was being strategic, but because I had absorbed some belief that my own visibility required someone else's permission. It didn't. It doesn't. Your accomplishments do not require external announcement, but they also do not require concealment, and there is a difference between the privacy that protects your position and the silence that protects someone else's comfort. I have gotten better, slowly, at knowing which is which. The second, when someone shows you who they are in the small moments, the tone they use when they don't think it matters, the corrections they don't make when they easily could, believe them. Not with judgment, not with bitterness, just with accuracy. Daniel showed me who he was in dozens of small moments across 6 years, in the way he looked at his plate instead of at me, in the way he preferred the version of his life that didn't require him to tell the truth. I kept finding explanations for those moments that were more generous than accurate. The generous explanation is sometimes right. In this case, it wasn't. Accuracy is kinder to yourself than misplaced generosity. The third, documentation is not revenge. Documentation is not cruelty. Documentation is the practice of keeping an accurate record of reality at a time when other people are working very hard to convince you that your perception is unreliable. I kept records because I am trained to keep records, because it is how I think, because it is what my professional life has required me to do. Those records were, in the end, the most important thing I had. Not the emotions, not the history, not the love. Those were real, and they mattered, and they left marks that I carry in ways I don't always have language for. But in the room where things were decided, the records were what changed the outcome. Keep your records. Date them. Keep them somewhere he cannot access. Trust the information your instincts are trying to give you, and then turn that information into documentation. I think about the moment James Whitmore walked through that dining room door sometimes, not with triumph, or not only with triumph, I'll be honest, but with something more like recognition. That was the moment when reality, which had been present all along, simply became visible. Vivian had been wrong not because she was a bad person in any total sense, but because she had operated from a model of the world that was missing essential information, and she had been confident enough in that model that she had never thought to question it. The world corrected her. Not harshly, not cruelly, just completely. That's usually how correction works. When you've let the silence go on long enough, I don't owe anyone silence about what happened. I don't owe Daniel a curated version of this story that preserves his reputation. I don't owe Vivian the comfort of knowing this story isn't circulating. I owe the truth what I've always owed it, which is accuracy and the refusal to arrange my life around someone else's convenience. I poured my coffee this morning standing at the east-facing window, looking at the bay in the early light, and I thought about the woman who sat in that kitchen in Palo Alto with a cup of tea gone cold beside her and said to herself, "How long? And then how much?" And then started planning. I am proud of her. Not for surviving. Surviving is the floor, not the ceiling. But for deciding in that moment and every moment after it that what was hers was worth the work of protecting it. I kept the name Whitfield. In every context that matters, I kept the name. It fit. If this story woke something in you, if there was a moment where you thought, I know what that silence feels like, I know what it costs to keep quiet about something that is yours, leave a comment below and tell me where you're watching from. Tell me what landed. Tell me what part of it you're still thinking about. And if you know someone who is organizing their life around someone else's comfort at the expense of their own clarity, share this video with them. Because sometimes we need to see that it is possible to know the truth, to hold it carefully, and to let it land at exactly the right moment with exactly the right weight. Leave your like, subscribe to the channel, and hit the notification bell. Because here, we tell stories about women who understood that patience is not passivity, that documentation is power, and that the moment of correction, when it finally comes, is worth every quiet day you spent preparing for it. A strong hug. And remember, you do not owe anyone silence about what they built on top of you.